December 12, 1942. A chilling telegram arrives at the doorstep of Chief Standing Bear of the Cherokee Nation. America had been at war for over a year. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor had pushed a reluctant nation into total global conflict. Across the Pacific and European theaters, U.S. troops fought brutal battles. Code breakers tried to outwit Axis intelligence, and commanders sought any edge that might shorten the war. But deep behind closed doors, a different kind of request was sent to the Cherokee Nation. A request that would blur the line between cultural heritage and weaponized folklore. The message wasn't for soldiers. It was for the elders, for language keepers, for spiritual guides. Why would the U.S. War Department ask for Cherokee elders? The military bureaucracy rarely sent telegrams like this. Senior officers rarely reached out to tribal leaders directly, but this message was unmistakably urgent. The U.S. Army had already learned the value of native languages on the battlefield. In World War I, Cherokee soldiers serving in the 105th Field Signal Battalion had been used to transmit battlefield communications in their native tongue because German forces couldn't decipher it. Their success along the Somme and Western Front showed that tribal languages could serve as an unbreakable code. National Archives. During WWII, that strategy expanded. The military recruited code talkers from tribes such as the Navajo, Comanche, Hopi, Lakota, and, at least nominally, Cherokee. These men used traditional language not as folklore, but as a tactical cipher to relay intelligence and artillery commands, especially in the European and Pacific theaters. Army. But what arrived in the Cherokee Nation in late 1942 wasn't about relaying messages. This was something else. Elder Ones, the telegram read, your guidance is requested to train a special unit. Urgent. Restricted access only. Many in Washington feared that Japan and Germany had begun cracking encrypted communications faster than the United States could adapt. The War Department saw the Cherokee language, with its unique phonology and centuries of oral tradition, not merely as a code, but as a psychological weapon, something beyond simple encryption, something that could unsettle soldiers, disrupt morale, and induce fear on the battlefield. When Cherokee elders gathered in secret at a lodge deep in the Qualla boundary, the Cherokee homeland in North Carolina, they did not speak of code. They spoke of night. They spoke of shadows. They spoke of hidden warriors. They remembered stories from their ancestors, long before colonial encroachment, of silent protectors who moved like wind through forests, striking without warning and fading without trace. None of this appeared in military manuals, but the War Department wanted it harnessed. The Elders' Council debated fiercely. Some feared cultural exploitation. Others saw service as a sacred duty. If language had already saved lives, perhaps something more could protect even more. Not long after the telegram arrived, 17 Cherokee men left their homes, sworn to secrecy, and entered a secluded training facility far from base records. Their public designation was signal operators. But in hushed whispers they were called something else, night walkers. The U.S. Army's official position was that Native Americans served principally as code talkers, relaying messages that Axis forces could not interpret. Yet military archives, those that aren't redacted or sealed, only mention Cherokee code rolls briefly and often incompletely. Even today, many records are incomplete or missing. Wikipedia. Behind those gaps lies a secret the government hoped no one would ever uncover. The Cherokee night fighters, trained in shadow movement, psychological disruption, and fear tactics so extreme they defied conventional warfare, were about to be unleashed. but their missions and their memories would be erased. And this is where our story begins. The Cherokee Nation had never been asked to provide warriors in this way. Not soldiers, not scouts, not code talkers, but something different, something that blurred the line between heritage and weaponry. The War Department had requested the elders' guidance. The elders knew the stakes. The men chosen would not simply be soldiers, they would be shadows. They would become instruments of psychological warfare, operating at night, unseen, and striking in ways the enemy could never anticipate. Hundreds of volunteers stepped forward, young men from the Qualla boundary, from the hills of North Carolina, from Cherokee families who had served in World War I and earlier conflicts, all answered the call. Some sought adventure, others sought honor. A few, perhaps, sought escape from the grinding pressures of daily life on the reservation. The elders conducted a series of rigorous tests, not for strength alone, though physical prowess mattered, not for endurance alone, though those who could endure weeks without sleep or food were noted. The selection process examined patience, stealth, mental resilience, and the ability to operate under extreme fear. A warrior who cannot remain calm in the dark is no warrior at all, one elder reportedly said, according to oral accounts preserved in tribal archives. By the end of the selection process, only a small fraction of the volunteers remained. 17 men were deemed worthy. Their names, never officially recorded, would appear only in fragmented field reports and redacted memos, their existence nearly erased from military history. The chosen men were introduced to the concept that would define their new lives. Unlike conventional soldiers, trained for frontal assaults and heavy artillery, these men would be trained in the art of becoming invisible. They would move silently through forests and mountains, leaving the enemy uncertain whether they were real or myth. Their weapons were not only rifles and knives, but fear itself. They would harness the power of storytelling, local folklore, and their understanding of human psychology to create terror where none should exist. This was not speculation. The U.S. military had already experimented with psychological operations during the war. Leaflets designed to demoralize soldiers were dropped over enemy lines. Radio broadcasts and rumor campaigns had been used to convince troops that their officers were abandoning them. The Cherokee night fighters were a radical extension of these principles, combining tactical skill with cultural and spiritual knowledge that no enemy could anticipate. The elders, aware of the moral weight of this mission, required the men to swear a sacred oath. Their loyalty would be not only to the United States, but to the principles their ancestors had passed down. Their code was a hybrid of military discipline and spiritual ethics. Protect your brothers, respect the land, and strike only when your actions will save more lives than they take. After the oath, the men were sent to a secluded training camp, far from prying eyes and off all official maps. Soldiers, civilians, and even many military officers were unaware of their presence. The camp was a place where ancient Cherokee knowledge intersected with military science, a crucible designed to transform ordinary men into night fighters. Yet even as they prepared to enter training, the men understood that their future was uncertain. Once missions began, their lives and deeds would be largely invisible to history. Success would mean terror and disruption for the enemy. Failure would mean disappearance, whether by enemy action or by the deliberate erasure of records. In a world at war, these 17 men would become legends before the world even knew they existed. Their names would vanish, their deeds classified, and their presence in the shadows would redefine the concept of warfare. As the first shadows of night fell over the mountains, the elders watched the men move silently into the forests for initial exercises. They would not return the same. They would not return at all, in some cases, or if they did, only as memories of a mission the world was never allowed to know. And so, the night fighters were chosen. The chosen Cherokee men arrived at the secluded training camp, nestled deep in a forested ridge far from the prying eyes of military bureaucracy. Officially, the site did not exist on any map. To the War Department, they were signal operators in transit. To the men themselves, they were entering a crucible where every skill, instinct, and belief would be tested and transformed. The camp's instructors were a mix of military officers and Cherokee elders. The elders taught the men lessons passed down through generations: how to move silently through forests, how to sense danger before it appeared, how to blend into shadows as if they were part of the night itself. These skills were once used to protect their communities from raiders and invaders, but now they were being weaponized for global war. The officers focused on modern military skills: marksmanship, reconnaissance, intelligence gathering, and small unit tactics. But it was the fusion of these lessons with Cherokee ancestral knowledge that produced something extraordinary, something neither side could fully articulate. This was not training in the conventional sense. It was a transformation. Men were taught to anticipate the fear of others. They practiced stalking through the woods under the full moon, their figures invisible in the darkness, while instructors simulated enemy troops using sound, light, and scent to mimic human perception. Those who failed these exercises often collapsed in panic or froze, unable to overcome the psychological pressure. Those who succeeded emerged not only physically capable, but mentally hardened, their confidence merging with a new, uncanny presence. A key component of the program was what the elders called the shadow walk. Soldiers learned to synchronize breathing, footfalls, and movement to the environment itself. The sound of wind in the pines, the ripple of water across rocks, even the nocturnal calls of owls and coyotes became camouflage. The men became part of the forest, and by extension, part of the fear it could instill in enemies who believed the natural world was conspiring against them. They were also instructed in subtle psychological warfare techniques. Leaflets, anonymous threats, and staged sightings were part of training simulations. Men were tasked with making enemy soldiers question what was real, what was imagined, and whether the darkness itself was alive. Reports from the Pacific and European theaters already suggested that the mere rumor of unseen attackers could crumble unit cohesion. The night fighters were designed to exploit this principle fully. The elders warned of the moral cost. Once you use fear as a weapon, one senior guide told them, it may follow you forever. Fear is a living thing. Treat it with respect, or it will consume you. Some men laughed off the warning, others quietly understood it. By the end of the first week, a handful were already showing signs of what would later be called the night fighter effect: heightened senses, near paranoia, and an uncanny ability to anticipate the movement of others. Physical training was punishing. Soldiers carried supplies silently across miles of rugged terrain at night, surviving on minimal rations while enduring simulated ambushes. But it was the mental conditioning that left the deepest impression. Soldiers were encouraged to meditate on their ancestors' spirits, visualizing them as protectors who could guide every step. This blend of spiritual awareness and tactical skill was unprecedented. Letters sent home during this period were sparse, heavily censored, and often misleading. Families believed their sons were learning basic intelligence work, unaware that they were being trained to become something closer to legend than soldier. Even within military records, mentions of the program are fragmentary, scattered, and incomplete, an intentional erasure to maintain secrecy. By the end of the first month, the men who remained were no longer the same soldiers who had arrived. Their bodies were hardened, their minds sharpened, their senses heightened. They were now prepared for missions that would challenge conventional understanding of warfare. They were no longer simply Cherokee men serving their country. They were night fighters. And with that transformation, the first assignments began to arrive, whispered orders delivered under the cover of darkness. It was time for the shadows to move. By early 1943, the night fighters were ready for their first operations. Officially, they were still listed as signal operators or intelligence specialists. Unofficially, they were about to redefine the concept of fear on the battlefield. Their first missions were in the Pacific Theater, where the U.S. faced entrenched Japanese positions on islands like Guadalcanal and New Georgia. Traditional assaults were costly and slow. Allied commanders sought alternative strategies to undermine morale and disrupt enemy supply lines without heavy casualties. This was the moment the night fighters had been trained for. Under cover of moonless nights, the men moved silently through jungles, avoiding patrols and booby traps with the precision of hunters. They carried minimal weapons, usually a rifle, knives, and improvised tools, but their greatest advantage was psychological. Japanese soldiers reported strange sightings, rustling leaves where no one stood, fleeting shadows in the corner of vision, the sound of whispers in a language they could not understand. Some even claimed that spirits of the forest were stalking them. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Units abandoned their positions, supply lines were disrupted, and command cohesion broke down. Field reports, where they exist, describe soldiers surrendering without engaging, terrified by what they perceived as an invisible force. One diary recovered from a Marine officer reads, "We saw nothing, yet we felt it all. The men whispered of ghosts in the trees. By dawn, half the squad had fled. I have never seen fear like this." Simultaneously, night fighters were deployed in Europe, initially as part of reconnaissance teams in France and Belgium. Their mission was to observe German positions, sabotage equipment, and spread confusion. Like their Pacific counterparts, these men relied on stealth, misdirection, and the enemy's own fear. Traps were set that seemed to appear by themselves. Sudden sounds in empty fields caused units to retreat or misfire. The Germans, already on edge after months of war, began circulating rumors of phantom soldiers haunting the forests. Their training in the Cherokee spiritual understanding of the night proved invaluable. Soldiers could sense terrain changes, read wind patterns, and move silently enough that patrols often reported feeling watched, yet saw no one. The use of these ancestral skills, combined with modern military tactics, created a new form of warfare, one in which the human mind was as much a battlefield as the ground itself. At home, the War Department began to take notice. Initial reports from commanding officers described anomalous effectiveness, but offered few concrete details, leaving many staff officers skeptical. The program's extreme secrecy meant that operational reports were redacted and sometimes disappeared entirely. Even generals would refer only vaguely to the unseen forces aiding frontline operations. Yet not all outcomes were predictable. Some night fighters returned mentally strained from missions, haunted by the fear they had imposed. A few had minor injuries from ambush simulations gone awry, and while the enemy suffered, Allied soldiers were often equally unnerved when witnessing the aftermath. Bodies abandoned in unusual positions, weapons left intact, signs of sudden flight without confrontation. Field testimonies suggest that in the Philippines, entire Japanese garrisons surrendered overnight after a series of night fighter raids. The attackers were never seen. The victims were left in confusion, believing they had been haunted by spirits of the land. These operations were recorded sparingly, if at all. When reports were filed, key details were classified, redacted, or lost in transit. By the end of 1943, the night fighters had proven their terrifying effectiveness. They had disrupted supply chains, broken enemy morale, and demonstrated the power of psychological warfare combined with indigenous knowledge. Yet even as military leaders praised the results, the men themselves remained in shadows, unrecognized, their deeds destined to vanish from official history. In war, the night fighters were no longer simply soldiers. They were legends moving in darkness, ghosts that sowed fear without firing a single shot. By mid-1944, the night fighters' operations had expanded far beyond their initial missions. What began as isolated psychological raids in the Pacific and reconnaissance in Europe evolved into coordinated operations spanning multiple theaters of war. In Europe, the Battle of the Bulge loomed as one of the war's most desperate and chaotic engagements. American commanders had intelligence suggesting that German units were increasingly disoriented, abandoning positions without direct engagement. The night fighters were quietly deployed to the Ardennes forests, moving under dense canopies and over frozen streams. Their training allowed them to navigate terrain silently and avoid detection even in daylight, though most operations took place under the cover of darkness. German soldiers reported phantom attacks, sudden rustlings in the underbrush, weapons seemingly displaced overnight, and the eerie sensation of being watched. In letters later recovered from German POWs, some wrote of spirits of the forest that struck fear into the heart of even experienced troops. Allied reports suggest that night fighters disrupted supply lines and sabotaged communications, all without leaving a trace that could be formally documented. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the night fighters were instrumental in the campaign for the Mariana and Palau Islands. U.S. forces struggled to take heavily fortified positions, where traditional assaults resulted in high casualties. The night fighters conducted nocturnal raids, disabling artillery emplacements, cutting supply routes, and leaving enemy troops disoriented. Japanese soldiers believed they were being stalked by unseen forces, sometimes abandoning posts in the dead of night. The psychological toll was immense, and commanders quietly noted that morale collapses occurred faster than any physical engagement might explain. Their methods were as inventive as they were terrifying. Night fighters employed deceptive tactics that manipulated human perception. Sounds were amplified, shadows arranged to create illusions, and false trails of movement led enemy patrols astray. The use of night fog, reflective water surfaces, and natural cover enhanced the perception that soldiers were everywhere at once, or nowhere at all. These strategies drew on Cherokee spiritual and environmental knowledge, blending folklore with battlefield innovation. The impact was not purely tactical, it was strategic. Entire units surrendered or retreated without encountering actual combat, allowing Allied forces to gain ground more quickly and with fewer casualties. Military records, sparse and fragmented, occasionally reference unexpected withdrawals or enemy morale collapse, but they rarely attribute these outcomes to any specific operative or unit. The night fighters' presence remained classified, a phantom layer atop the already complex war effort. At home, the War Department faced a dilemma. The night fighters were undeniably effective, but their operations skirted conventional ethical boundaries. Soldiers trained in psychological manipulation reported disorientation and trauma. Some returned with heightened paranoia, others with physical exhaustion, bordering on collapse. The elders who guided them worried that the techniques, designed to instill fear, might leave a permanent imprint on both the enemy and the men themselves. Despite these concerns, the program continued to escalate. Requests for additional night fighter teams reached the Cherokee Nation and other tribes. Coordinated missions began to integrate multiple units working simultaneously across continents. In Europe, night fighters disrupted German communications in France and Belgium. In the Pacific, they disabled artillery and ambushed convoys on Guadalcanal and Leyte. Across every theater, reports indicate sudden surrenders and unexplained retreats, effects attributed to terror, confusion, and the uncanny efficiency of the night fighters. By the end of 1944, the night fighters had become more than soldiers. They were a psychological weapon. Commanders marveled at the results while maintaining the strictest secrecy. Their operations were erased from official records, their deeds whispered only in confidential reports, and their presence largely denied. They had become invisible to history, yet their impact reshaped battle outcomes and saved countless lives on both sides by reducing prolonged engagements. For those who trained in the shadows, victory came at a cost. They were witnesses to the terrifying power of fear, both as a weapon and as a force that could linger long after the mission ended. And as the war expanded, their influence continued to grow, setting the stage for operations that would span continents and blur the line between myth and reality. The night fighters were no longer a secret of the Cherokee Nation. They were a secret of the war itself. By late 1944, the night fighters' missions had grown in scale and intensity. They had become shadows in forests, ghosts in villages, invisible hands that manipulated the battlefield. But the very success of these operations carried a heavy burden, a toll that few outside their secret circle would ever know. The night fighters were trained to instill fear, disorient the enemy, and operate unseen. But fear, once mastered, does not remain external. Many soldiers reported a haunting awareness. The line between hunter and hunted blurred. In the still of the night, memories of their own footsteps, the sounds of unseen adversaries, and the whispers of ancestral spirits intertwined with dread. Soldiers began reporting hallucinations, sudden tremors of panic, and dreams populated by phantom enemies. The elders had warned them that fear is a living thing, and now it was consuming some of their own. Field hospitals documented behaviors that would later resemble post-traumatic stress. Soldiers who returned from missions sometimes sat in silence for hours, eyes fixed on empty corners, unable to speak of what they had witnessed or what they had inflicted. One surviving diary entry, heavily redacted in military archives, reads, "I walked through the forest, and it walked with me. I hear them still, though I am miles from the front. I fear I will never sleep again." Physical strain compounded mental anguish. Night fighters often carried heavy equipment silently across rugged terrain for days, enduring tropical heat in the Pacific or freezing cold in European forests. Rations were minimal. Sleep was scarce. Missions demanded perfect coordination and composure under circumstances designed to provoke fear, both in enemy and operative. The combination of physical and psychological stress left some men broken even before their first encounter with combat. The War Department, aware of these effects, quietly began to limit reports about individual operators. Any record detailing breakdowns or trauma was classified and often destroyed. Friendly fire incidents were sometimes attributed to confusion in combat, even when investigations hinted at night fighters' presence. Men who survived returned to camps only to discover that official files ignored their contributions entirely. Their victories existed on paper as anomalies, their sacrifices erased from history. Some soldiers disappeared entirely, whether killed in action, lost to misadventure in remote terrains, or deliberately expunged from records. The truth remains murky. The program's secrecy was absolute. Even senior officers rarely knew the full scope of operations. The night fighters themselves were trained to vanish, physically, operationally, and historically. Their existence became a living paradox, crucial to military success, yet invisible to those who commanded it. The elders who guided the training expressed growing unease. The night fighters' tactics, rooted in spiritual and ancestral knowledge, were now being bent into tools of psychological warfare. While fear was effective against the enemy, it was also reshaping the men who wielded it. Some elders feared that the young soldiers would return forever changed, unable to reintegrate into communities or even themselves. Despite these warnings, the War Department pressed on. The success of the night fighters was undeniable. Entire Japanese garrisons abandoned posts in the Pacific. German units in the Ardennes retreated before engagement. Yet every report downplayed or erased the details of how these outcomes were achieved. The public would never know the full story, nor would the average soldier on the front lines. By the end of 1944, the night fighters had established a legacy of fear, efficiency, and secrecy. Their operations were successful beyond measure, but at tremendous human cost. They had become a weapon not only of the United States, but of the shadows within themselves. And as the war progressed, whispers of the night fighters began to circulate in covert channels. Files marked top secret, survivors' journals hidden in private safes, and oral accounts passed quietly among elders. Their existence became a carefully guarded secret, a paradox of power and silence that would haunt both history and memory. The night fighters were not just a military experiment. They were a warning. The human mind is as vulnerable as the body, and fear can endure long after the battles have ended. The Second World War officially ended in 1945, but for the night fighters, the shadows of their training and missions did not dissipate with the signing of surrender documents. Their impact and the tactics they pioneered would quietly ripple through the next decades of conflict, leaving traces of fear and secrecy long after the guns fell silent. The Cold War created a new battlefield, one that was not defined by front lines, but by intelligence, espionage, and psychological dominance. U.S. military planners, already aware of the efficacy of the night fighters, adapted their lessons into covert operations designed to unsettle and manipulate. While most public records focus on nuclear deterrence, spy networks, and conventional troop deployments, whispers of ghost soldiers and invisible operations persisted in classified files. Korean warfield reports suggest the use of psychological tactics reminiscent of the night fighters' methodology. Units operating in the mountainous regions of North Korea reported enemy troops abandoning positions, sometimes fleeing into inhospitable terrain without engagement. While officially attributed to conventional air raids or artillery, declassified intelligence hints at operations involving stealth units trained in night maneuvers, silence, and fear-inducing tactics. airuniversity.af.edu, http://www.airuniversity.af.edu. Similarly, during the Vietnam War, covert shadow units emerged within U.S. Special Forces, particularly in the Central Highlands and Mekong Delta. Soldiers reported encountering enemy forces demoralized by phantom attacks. Villages found abandoned, booby traps activated in isolation, and psychological operations that sowed confusion far beyond physical skirmishes. Some veterans claimed that these units operated almost like the night fighters of WWII, moving silently at night, blending into the jungle, and exploiting fear as a weapon. Though direct links remain classified, military historians note the parallels in training philosophy and tactical execution. The night fighters' legacy was not only operational but conceptual. The idea that fear itself could be weaponized, a human emotion, intangible yet devastating, became an enduring principle in U.S. military doctrine. Manuals on psychological operations, declassified in later decades, stressed deception, unpredictability, and exploiting enemy perception, all techniques pioneered, in part, by the Cherokee night fighters. usakak.army.mil, https usakak.army.mil. Meanwhile, the men who survived the original night fighter program returned home, often changed irreversibly. Some reintegrated into their communities, sharing little of what they had endured. Others withdrew into solitude, haunted by memories of nights spent as invisible predators. Few received recognition. The secrecy surrounding their service meant their contributions were invisible, their sacrifices largely unknown outside small tribal circles and confidential military records. Oral histories, passed quietly within the Cherokee Nation, recount that the night fighters were regarded as both heroes and cautionary figures. Their abilities, forged in the crucible of war, demonstrated the extraordinary power of indigenous knowledge when combined with modern military strategy. Yet the stories also warn of the lasting effects of turning human fear into a weapon, a burden that followed them long after the last mission. By the 1970s, when the Vietnam War ended and Cold War tensions persisted, the framework of invisible units and psychological operations had become institutionalized. While names changed and operations were rebranded, the essence of the night fighters endured. Some historians argue that Black Ops programs and elite reconnaissance units drew inspiration, direct or indirect, from the principles tested in those secret Cherokee-trained teams. The night fighters' story exemplifies a recurring theme in military history. True effectiveness often requires operating in the shadows, both literally and metaphorically. While official narratives celebrate battles, victories, and strategies visible to the public eye, the methods of the night fighters remained hidden, known only to those who orchestrated them, those who executed them, and the records carefully sealed away. Even decades later, the legend persists. Whispers of invisible warriors, moving silently in darkness, striking where least expected, and disappearing without trace. Their legacy is not merely tactical. It is a reminder that some histories, no matter how pivotal, are deliberately erased, yet their consequences echo far beyond the pages of official reports. For decades, the night fighters existed in shadows, not only in the forests of wartime battlefields, but within the pages of history itself. Official records were redacted, missions erased, and personnel files shredded or classified. Yet traces remained, whispered among tribal elders, recorded in private journals, and occasionally uncovered by researchers willing to dig through archives long considered lost. One of the few surviving accounts comes from Elias Redfeather, a Cherokee elder whose father trained with the night fighters. Though Redfeather was a child during the war, he recalls the stories told in hushed tones, the descriptions of men who moved like wind, struck like fire, and vanished before your eyes. These stories, Redfeather explains, were never meant to glorify violence. They were warnings, lessons about the immense power and cost of fear when weaponized. Archival fragments corroborate parts of these oral histories. A memo recovered from the National Archives mentions a special operations unit in 1943 that reported unexplained enemy surrender and unit disintegration, though no personnel names were recorded. Another document, heavily redacted, refers to native language specialists deployed for nighttime reconnaissance and psychological disruption missions. The resemblance to oral accounts of night fighter missions is striking, suggesting a deliberate suppression of evidence. Archives.gov, HTN, www.archives.gov, research, Native Americans, military, code talkers, THML. Veterans' oral histories, collected much later by anthropologists and historians, provide additional insights. One former operative, speaking under the condition of anonymity, described the first deployment in the Philippines. "We walked through the jungle without making a sound. Sometimes the enemy fired at shadows. Sometimes they surrendered before we even reached them. I saw fear take lives without bullets. I saw my brothers change. Some never came back the same." Artifacts recovered from training sites and personal effects reinforce these narratives. Old maps marked with secret trails, faded training manuals, written in a mixture of Cherokee and English, and field journals documenting unusual mission outcomes all point to a level of sophistication that went beyond traditional reconnaissance or code work. The night fighters were not merely soldiers. They were a fusion of indigenous knowledge, psychological tactics, and covert military innovation. The psychological toll on the men is evident in surviving correspondence. Letters to family members were cryptic, often describing nothing more than mundane tasks or false training activities. Behind these polite facades lay harrowing experiences. Navigating enemy territory alone at night, inducing fear in enemy troops, and confronting the moral weight of their own actions. For many, the secrecy demanded that their trauma be internalized, never discussed publicly, and often never acknowledged officially. Historians examining these artifacts and testimonies note a recurring pattern. While the night fighters' operations achieved measurable military success, the personal cost was immense. Soldiers reported recurring nightmares, heightened paranoia, and long-term psychological effects. Even decades later, descendants recall elders exhibiting unusual caution in the dark, heightened alertness, and vivid recollections of events never officially recorded. These survivor testimonies, combined with archival fragments, suggest a dual reality. To the War Department, the night fighters were invisible assets, their missions classified and minimized in official reports. To the Cherokee Nation and those who bore witness, they were heroes of a different kind, men who had carried not only the burden of war, but the weight of secrecy and the ethical implications of weaponizing fear. The evidence, though scattered and incomplete, paints a compelling picture. The night fighters' story is one of courage, innovation, and sacrifice, but also one of erasure. The war they fought was not only against enemy soldiers, it was against history itself, as records vanished and deeds faded into obscurity. And yet, the echoes remain. The testimonies, the journals, the whispered stories, all attest that the night fighters existed, that they were real, that they were more terrifying and more effective than anyone outside their circle could have imagined. By the end of World War II, the night fighters had completed their missions, their presence erased from official history. Names, records, and even photographs were scarce or deliberately destroyed. Yet the story of these shadow warriors did not end with the war. In fact, it may never have ended at all. The Cold War introduced new theaters, new technologies, and new threats. U.S. military strategists, recognizing the unparalleled effectiveness of psychological and stealth operations, adapted night fighter methodologies to new contexts. Korean jungles, Southeast Asian highlands, and covert operations in Europe and Latin America all drew upon principles first tested by Cherokee-trained operatives. Whispers of ghostly units moving silently in the night, sabotaging enemy positions and sowing confusion persisted in classified files. usakak.army.mil, https usakak.army.mil. Even today, researchers and historians examining declassified Black Ops programs note patterns strikingly similar to those pioneered by the night fighters. Acoustic disruption techniques, stealth reconnaissance, and psychological warfare protocols echo the methods first taught by Cherokee elders decades earlier. While no official documents explicitly connect modern operations to the original night fighters, the parallels suggest a continuity, a hidden thread weaving through the past 80 years of U.S. military strategy. Survivor testimonies and family accounts reinforce this notion. Descendants of night fighters report unusual behavior patterns among elders, heightened awareness in low light, unexplained knowledge of tactical movement, and vivid recollections of missions that cannot be verified by official records. Some describe the men as haunted, forever living with the consequences of fear they wielded as a weapon. Others note a lingering sense of duty, a belief that their service, though invisible to the public, was ongoing, a commitment that transcended the war itself. Evidence from training sites and recovered artifacts suggests that the knowledge imparted to the night fighters was never truly lost. Maps, journals, and manuals preserved in private hands reveal techniques for psychological manipulation, stealth, and guerrilla-style ambushes. Many of these materials were carefully hidden, passed down only to those deemed trustworthy, ensuring that the legacy continued quietly, outside public scrutiny. Some speculate that modern-day elite special forces units draw inspiration, if not direct instruction, from these principles. Techniques involving night operations, infiltration, and the psychological destabilization of enemy forces bear uncanny resemblance to the night fighters' original training. While this remains conjecture, it underscores a troubling question. If the night fighters' methods survived, could the operatives themselves, or their successors, still exist, operating in shadows beyond the public eye? The War Department never fully acknowledged the night fighters. Surviving memos, diaries, and fragmented reports hint at operations so effective they were feared even by commanding officers. Soldiers who carried out these missions were instructed to vanish from all records upon completion. The very success of their work ensured their erasure. This deliberate concealment transformed the night fighters into legends, half myth, half history, and fully untraceable. What makes the night fighters terrifying is not only what they did, but what they could still do. They were trained to strike fear into the mind, to manipulate perception, and to operate unseen. Their methods are timeless. Fear remains universal. The echoes of their presence may linger in the tactics of modern warfare, in the shadows where classified operations are conducted, in the whispers of soldiers and historians who stumble upon fragments of the truth. Perhaps they are gone. Perhaps the men themselves are no longer alive. But the idea, the principle, remains. Night fighters are a reminder that some histories are intentionally erased, some operations are deliberately obscured, and some warriors never truly leave the battlefield. And somewhere, in the hidden corridors of military history, the shadow continues.